Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Mitchell, here to talk to you today about variables and assignments. In this video, we're going to be focusing on exploring what variables are and how we can use these variables to represent and store information. So, what are we learning today? Today, we're going to learn how to represent different types of values with variables in our programs, specifically focusing on how variables are abstractions that are inside of a program that can hold values. We're also going to look at good and bad names for variables, as well as explore the different types of information that we can store in those variables. So, what is a variable? Simply put, a variable is an abstraction that we can use in our programs to hold values. Now, those values can be numbers, they can be text, they can be lists, they can be boolean values, they can hold all kinds of information. So we're going to look at exactly how that works and how a program actually manages that information. So a variable is essentially just a box. Okay, I can take this box and store maybe numbers, let's say maybe the value 10, and then I can give this little box here a name, num students. So now this little fancy box here holds the value 10 into a variable or a box named num students. I can also do that with Boolean values. If I have the Boolean value true or false, and maybe I have a box that I want to store maybe false inside of, and now I can store that in a variable called isPassing. I can also have a box that contains text. So maybe I have the text hello world, and I want to put this little guy inside that box so that way I can find it and store it in a variable called welcome. What's nice about these little boxes of information is that in my program, I can specifically refer to each of these boxes by their names. Essentially, same as variables. I can store values inside of variables and refer to them specifically by their names. So let's look at some examples in terms of code itself. Let's say, for example, I wanted to create a variable in my program to store the high score that I got in a game. I might call that particular variable high score. It's very simple. It's to the point. It's very obvious what kind of information it's storing. If I'm trying to store maybe somebody's name to greet them in a program and say, welcome, Dr. Mitchell, I could store their name in a variable. In this case, if I wanted to do my first name, Jamila, I could store that inside of a first name variable. I could store the value true or false inside of a is raining variable because I need to have a variable to keep track of whether or not it's raining. I'm in Florida, so it's more than likely that this is true. Or I could even have a variable to store my phone number because maybe I need to maintain some kind of contact list like what you find on your phone. Then each phone number could be referred to by a variable called phone number. It's important to also be mindful of how we name these variables. So notice that on the left side, I have the variable name high score. It's much better and more concise than using the variable name highest score in the game. While it also conveys the purpose of that variable, it's just very long and would be a little bit more tricky to manage, and more likely I'm going to run into spelling errors and stuff. With the variable for a name, having just a variable called n is not very descriptive of the purpose of that variable. If I just see the letter N all throughout my program, I wouldn't be able to look at that and very quickly and easily tell what that variable is for. Calling a variable is it raining with spaces would also cause a problem because I can't actually use spaces in a variable name anyways. So that would be less ideal than using the is raining variable. For storing a phone number. Using phone number is much better than trying to do 555 dash number because there's a lot of special characters that I can't use, like these dashes. And I also don't want to start a variable name with a number. The type of data that I store inside of these variables would also help me decide what kind of operations I can do with those variables. So what kind of data I choose to store this variable as, or this information as in this variable, is also important. In this case, with high score, I'm probably going to be doing addition and subtraction to, like, add to or subtract from that particular number. So it would be ideal to store that information as an integer or numbers. When dealing with a first name, since that is text, it would be more ideal to store that data as text, or as most programming languages refer to, as a string. The variable is raining. I'm trying to store whether or not it is or is not raining. So that's only one of two values. So I'm going to use a boolean to give me true or false within that particular variable. With a phone number, while the phone number itself does consist of numbers, I'm not doing math with those numbers. I'm usually storing, searching, that kind of thing with a phone number. So in this case, it would be best to actually store that phone number as text, so I don't accidentally try to do math with a phone number. So let's practice and see how we do with naming our own variables. So first example, what would be the best variable name and data type to store a user's age in a program? I would choose age. And I would also store that as an integer, because I'm going to do math with that age, add 1 every year when it's their birthday. What would be the best variable name and data type to store the number of students in your class? I would probably name this num students, or something to that effect, something that's indicating I'm counting how many number of students I have. And again, I would store that as an integer, because that way I can add and subtract from the number of students. What would be the best variable name and data type to store the title of a movie? Well, the title is text. So I am going to probably name this movie title. That's very descriptive of what I'm trying to store. And I would store that as text or strings, so that way I can convey that information correctly. And what would be the best variable name and data type to store if someone's pet is a dog? So I'm trying to answer the question, yes or no, is it a dog? So I'm going to name this variable is dog, because it's kind of formatted in a very question type format. And I'm going to store that variable as a boolean, since I'm choosing between one of two choices, yes or no, true or false, is it a dog? Okay, lastly, what would be the best variable name and data type to store a student ID number? So I'm going to name this variable student ID. And again, think about what we're trying, the type of operations we would do with a student ID. I don't do math with a student ID. That ID is meant to represent you. So I'm going to store that as a text or string as well. So just to recap what we should take away from this, we now know how to represent values with variables. Those variables are abstractions that can hold information, just like my boxes. And the way that we name those variables is very important for how we can read and use our program code. And we can use these variables to store all kinds of information depending on what we're trying to achieve.